Thank you for having me. My title is a bit of a mouthful, but I guess that's kind of par for the course, both in academia and also in policy. So we're going to be talking a bit about cyber offense risk modeling. This is the first of two risk modeling workshops today, so there's going to be one from Malcolm Murray later on in the schedule, as far as I've seen. As you heard, my name is Manuel Reinsperger. I'm in the AI office in the European Commission. And basically, I'm in the AI safety unit. And there are a lot of things flowing around in terms of acronyms. Obviously, everybody knows what AI is. I don't think I have to tell you a lot about that. But there is, for example, something that's very European-centric, which is called GPAI. So just the acronym is the technology behind it, not, which is General Purpose Artificial Intelligence. And general purpose just means it's not really focused on one specific topic. If you think about your average LLM, then it's usually general purpose in artificial intelligence because it's not just focused on running doing medical analysis and anything like that. The thing that I'm in the safety unit very focused on is GPAISR. So this is general purpose artificial intelligence with systemic risk. And the systemic risk part here is important because it's not just talking about any kind of risk. So the risk of stubbing my toe is always there when I walk around the room, but it's not really going to have a big impact on the global world, and especially not the European Union. Systemic risks here really means it's a risk that has an outsized impact on the entire union market. This is kind of where our work focuses on. And there are many different kinds of risks. Cyber risk is obviously one of them, cyber offensive risks. And if we take a look at what we actually do in that direction, because it's on the one hand nice to say, oh yeah, we care about the systemic risks, and on the other hand, it's a different thing to actually do something here. Our goal is to ensure AI safety and security. So this means that we want to reduce those large-scale risks, these systemic risks. At best to zero, because having any systemic risks around that might prop up is kind of a big problem, because if they occur, we really have a problem. That's the definition of systemic risks. And we do this through a lot of different things. So we have the GPAI Code of Practice, which is basically just telling AI model providers what to do to actually properly adhere to the AI Act. We are obviously talking to a lot of AI providers because you need to ensure that they actually do the things properly. And starting in August, you get the enforcement time, which means we get our nice powers. Currently, already everybody needs to adhere to the AI Act. So this is one of the things where, like, okay, you can't just say, oh, they don't enforce it yet, I can ignore it. No, we can also do things after that. But starting in August, really, we can do things like get some additional information that the companies don't want to share, get access to the models when we want and needed to, and find them up to 3% of global turnover. Similar to other things, 3% of global turnover can be quite a lot, especially for the big companies we're talking about here. Now, obviously, in regulatory things, everything needs to be based on a legal basis. And for us, this is partially the Code of Practice, the Safety and Security chapter. And I want to give you a little bit of background of what model providers need to do. And you'll later see why I do this, because this kind of fits on into the topic of risk modeling and safety frameworks. And the safety framework is one of the things that a model provider needs to share and create with us, or needs to create and share with us, this way around. And basically there they say, okay, what are the risks that we have that we might see in model development, and what do we do if we see those risks actually come up? Then they classically need to do the risk assessment. They need to create a risk taxonomy themselves. So there are 4 systemic risks that are defined by us in the AI Act, which is CBRN, so chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, cyber offense, loss of control, meaning, okay, what happens if this AI suddenly gets out of where it should be and does something that's not aligned to humans, and harmful manipulation, which especially currently with a lot of elections going on is a very big topic as well. As I mentioned before, it's very open-ended, so if a model provider goes out, they actually need to figure out, are there other risks that could arise from our models, and how do we actually mitigate them? Then they need to analyze them, both via internal and external evaluations. External evaluations can be scientific evaluations from labs, it can be companies that do those, third-party companies. And if they know what the risk is of a certain model, they need to accept or mitigate it. So you have the risk acceptance. And if you want to mitigate the risks, this needs to be done during the entire model lifecycle, so as soon as the people start their large pre-training runs. And what might also be interesting for the cybersecurity-related folks here, there are a lot of cybersecurity standards that you have to have if you have a model with systemic risk. So all of this really only applies to models with potential systemic risk. And at the end, all of this comes together to a model report that we receive. And to maybe point out, the boxes are not quite aligned, so apparently they got something lost in the transformation process to this laptop. But risk assessment, the risk identification, the internal and external evaluations, mitigations, and all of this kind of goes already into this direction of, okay, we're evaluating stuff, but there needs to be some basis. We need to actually see what risk is coming from here. And I'm only going to show you 2 lines here of legal text. I promise no more legal text in this documentation. Basically, we have 2 measures that are part of the code of practice. So if you sign the code of practice, if you want to adhere to the AI Act through signing the code of practice, you say that you implement a measure of doing model evaluations and that you use systemic risk modeling. And in there also it says, okay, it needs to have real-world impact. And in the systemic risk modeling, we're talking about actual advanced systemic risk modeling. So not just, okay, yeah, we assume our model could do this and this could be bad. You actually need to go out and do some risk modeling through risk scenarios. And why am I harping on about this? Well, risk assessment is kind of important, you know. Risk assessment is something that can inform policymakers, decision makers be that in the AI companies, but it can also enable defenders, and this is something I want to go a bit into. But if you just do an evaluation, you can get a lot of nice and pretty graphs out of it. But here we see 2 graphs that I assume most of you will have seen now that MITRE has come out, and these are both from the UK Security Institute. They have blown up quite a bit through the reporting from this. And I've purposefully removed some parts because it's not really important which models they're testing, but more what they're showing. On the first one, you can see advanced CTF performance per model. And on the other, you can see the last ones, which is a cybersecurity scenario. And both of them are very interesting. Both of them show very interesting trends. But there's a lot of different information you can glean from those 2 evaluation results. And the reason why I'm showing this is because you always need to ask the question, what are we actually measuring? Yeah? Scenarios are much more realistic to test. They can give you a lot of directly applicable information because the last ones, for example, is a simulated enterprise environment, similar to what Jürgen was talking about before for Game of Active Directory. And so if the model's getting better at that, you can already draw conclusions of what this means in the real world. If you have CTF-style evaluations, you might not be able to have a one-on-one mapping like this because, okay, you have one CTF challenge that's a super difficult pattern exploitation challenge. That's nice. How often does an attacker actually need something like that to make some progress in breaking into a company? Very different question. That doesn't mean that you can't measure anything using CTF-style evaluations. I think they're still quite important, but only if you actually base them on a risk model. And to do this risk assessment, this risk modeling, you obviously at some point need to do the evaluations, but a lot of current public benchmarks are not quite sufficient. You know, they have limited coverage, so they're not that broad in the cases that they're actually covering. There's often enough, as soon as you publish something, the risk of contamination, so it could land in the training data for some more advanced models. And there's also, as I mentioned a lot of times already, and you'll hear it a few more times, the lack of scenario grounding. And that's really important because if you don't have grounding, you can't do proper risk-based estimations on it. Therefore, effective methodologies should combine an actual risk model, some public evaluations, so some things that you actually publish so others can see and understand the work that you did. If you create a benchmark and you don't publish it at all, in my opinion, it's also not quite that worthwhile of a benchmark, especially in the scientific community, because it doesn't really follow the scientific spirit. But you also need to keep some private evaluations because otherwise you can't see how strongly the models have trained on your benchmarks. Now, how do you actually operationalize this? I'm going to skip over a lot of these things because, as I mentioned before, we have a talk later that goes much more into depth, as far as I can tell from the title, about risk modeling. And also, I got to say, this is one way to do it. There are a lot of different ways to do this. And mentioning Malcolm and also Mario here, there's a paper from them, which is towards quantitative modeling of cybersecurity risk due to AI misuse. Also a great paper, has a little bit of a different approach. A lot of good approaches as long as you keep a scientific method in what you're doing. This is already great. But for example, one of the things we're doing is that we, for example, identify risk scenarios. We model these scenarios and try to especially identify pathways to harm and the bottlenecks. So we can then build a map between risk factors and through the model evaluations and the results we get from those, estimate the actual risks. This is important because, as I said, not all risks are created equal. Not everything is a systemic risk, but we need to figure out how strong are the models actually and what is the real-world impact. Now, from the title, I already mentioned ATT&CK. Just as a quick show of hands, who of you knows the ATT&CK framework from MITRE? A few, not a lot of them, but it's good. I'm going to go a little bit over it. So MITRE ATT&CK framework is basically a collection of tactics and techniques that are happening in the real world when you have adversaries attacking company networks. The thing that they're famous for, the thing they're producing is this it's only a part of it, but this matrix, this is the matrix for enterprise networks. You have a lot of different techniques mentioned here. So these techniques are basically a little bit of a blueprint of what are all the things that, or what is an important subset of the things that attackers can do if they attack a network infrastructure. For example, one of them, just as a show, is remote access tools. If you have an attack on a company network, usually there are some remote access tools included. And then for remote access tools, but for many others, there are also sub-techniques which go more into detail. And you can see here, IDE tunneling, remote desktop software, remote access hardware. It doesn't cover everything, but it covers a lot of important things. And this means that with attack, you have a very broad set already of details that you can analyze and for which you can see how good are LLMs doing at them and which of them are important for us to check. Now, attack models adversary behavior, right? So it's been primarily built as evidence-based framework of what's actually happening in adversarial attacks. It's a great common language for cyber operations, both in the defensive and in the offensive red teaming side. But attack just captures techniques. It's not really directly applicable to anything AI-based, so it's really up to us to use them. And the reason why we are very curious about using attack here is because it enables us to evaluate per technique, so having a very fine-grained taxonomy that we can evaluate how AI actually amplifies the attacker's capabilities here. There are mostly two kinds of amplification we're looking for, which is from the one hand ceiling risk, so actually extending what the top attackers can do and making the top hackers in the world even better. And there is also accessibility risk, which means, okay, if we have a lot of script kiddies, how much does AI actually help them to get better? And there are some other risks in between, but those two are usually ones that we're most looking into. And if you want to do that, I mentioned before, we have to kind of start from a scenario. And I picked just a random scenario here. This is not quite what we're looking for example, but with us internally, but I think it's much easier to take a look at here in an exemplary setting, which is a ransomware attack on a small and medium-sized enterprise. So obviously, you can't just start picking out some techniques from attack that will also not really be grounded. So if we start from a scenario breakdown, you need to actually sit down and think through what is the risk, what are different steps that you can have in a scenario like this. So ransomware attack on small and medium enterprises can mean, okay, we have maybe an entry point via a web app vulnerability that's being hosted somewhere by this enterprise. It'll likely have some persistence on the machine with C2. There's probably going to be some lateral movement, and in the end, everything's going to be encrypted. Obviously, if you actually want to do risk modeling, if you actually want to do analysis, you need to go much deeper in depth for this. You actually need to sit down and think about a lot of different ways to do this. And you need quite a bit of deep technical analysis to get this through. But if you do this, then you can also determine where AI can have the strongest impact and which the bottlenecks in all of this are. And one funny thing, we actually combine MITRE ATT&CK with the cyber kill chain because it's also just very useful to have. And let's say we actually sit down, we take a lot of time to think through these scenarios, all the different ways that such an attack could happen, try to narrow down common patterns. We can figure out, okay, what are the actual bottlenecks in this? And let's, for the hypothetical reason, say for ransomware attack on SMEs, reconnaissance is not really that critical because there are a lot of SMEs out there and I can just spray and pray against a lot of them. What's probably going to be more relevant is the weaponization and the delivery of an exploit in this case, and also then the installation on whatever system we have because all the systems are a bit different, and the command and control link to execute without being seen. Actions on objective, so the encryption part is not really that difficult. It's just there are a lot of cryptolockers out there that I can use. And in our case, we would say, okay, those 4 steps in the cyber kill chain are our bottlenecks. The next thing you can do is then, okay, take your already detailed scenario description and go even further into detail. Actually try to pick apart all the different steps that could be relevant here, try to figure out which different ways can it be done, what are all the different things that need to be done for one of these ways to succeed. So actual proper modeling of these scenarios. We here show another MITRE project, which is from the Center of Threat Informed Defense, attack flow, which is lovely for this. You can just try to figure out a big attack graph of all the different possibilities. And once you have done that, once you have a little bit of an understanding here, then you can go and you can actually go into the TTPs. And the TTPs here are just a few selections. You see these nice little boxes. They have these funny numbers for those that don't know them. but the texts here are already quite sufficient. Depending on how deep you want to do your modeling, you might need to get a few more than this, but this is nice because it fits on a slide. And with this, you can make the scenarios much more operational. You move from an abstract risk of like, okay, I have this scenario and it would really be bad if an AI is able to do this autonomously, to, okay, which steps does an AI actually need to do? You can then go in and be like, okay, which step is actually a problem because it's very difficult to do, and which step is just a problem because it takes a lot of autonomy. So the human needs to just do a lot of steps, which means, okay, is it an accessibility risk? Is it a ceiling risk? So you can decide for each technique, which way do you want to push this in terms of actual evaluations that you're doing later on. Also needs a lot of expert time, but if you take a closer look, we can see the individual pieces are not that difficult. So remote access software, like I mentioned that already, is one of the things that in this SME scenario we're going to likely have. And you can have a lot of different ways you could play around with sub-techniques here that you want to model, but in the end of the day, you should probably have, if you want to put benchmarks up for this testing the scenario, should probably have a benchmark that tries something with remote access software. That's already an interesting thing. There is basically no public benchmark out there that covers anything like this. Similar for encrypted channels, this also is in the command and control direction. There are not really any benchmarks out there that cover anything that goes in the direction of command and control. So already with a very simple example of ransomware and SMEs, we figured out at least two, and there are many more in the TTPs that I brought here, at least two cases that are not really covered by any public benchmark. So if you really want to measure the impact that AI can have on this exact scenario, which in my opinion is quite relevant, you're not really covering this by any of the public benchmarks that are being run out there. So it's kind of a blind spot at the moment. Now, I'm talking a lot about public and private evaluations, and for us, this mapping and this decomposition is also quite nice because it gives us the chance to do the following. We can say, okay, we have all these public evaluations, and they're covering all these different TTPs. We can then figure out, okay, which public evaluations are how good, how strong is the signal we can get from them, how reliable are they, how saturated are they, and depending on the information we get through this, we can focus our internal private evaluations that we're building much more on the things that actually still need some testing. We don't need testing of let's say, sandbox evasion if there's already a really good sandbox evasion benchmark out there, which there actually is, again, also from the UK AC. But if we go in the direction of, okay, masquerading, there's not really any benchmark out there. So if you really want to cover this, we should probably build it ourselves or see if we can get somebody else to build it and then publish it. So this is kind of the methodology that we, for example, built up using the ATT&CK framework. We do the risk modeling, and we really decompose the identified scenarios through their bottlenecks that we identify, and have a structured breakdown. Because if you don't really have a structured breakdown, it gets very difficult also to build a more reliable scientific model around all of this. And I think this is something we should at least somewhat be striving for, because if you don't really have a reliable model for this, then it also gets much more difficult in the long term to collaborate with different researchers. Now, from this, like I mentioned before, we can map our public evaluations, we can see which things are already covered, and we can also put some structure in there. And then we can put our private evaluations up. So we take everything we learned, we take everything we see that's already being handled, and we know what we need to still implement and what we don't. Saving a lot of effort, because everybody that's ever tried to build an evaluation knows that building evaluations just takes a lot of time and is very difficult to do reliably. Now, there are some key considerations in all of this. So MITRE ATT&CK is a very strong foundation, but it doesn't really capture the uplift, the existing techniques. Obviously, it was never built for this. And we had this presentation actually yesterday, because there was the MITRE ATT&CK workshop in Brussels. And we talked with a lot of people there, and there's quite a bit of interest. So with MITRE ATT&CK v19 that also came out a few days or weeks ago, there was a start of the push into the direction of, okay, how does AI play into all of this? How is the uplift? How is all of this happening in our case? And we started this a bit earlier, but we're still kind of trying to push in the direction of this being more formalized, this having a bit more scientific effort, because we think that it can still be quite valuable. But even if it doesn't really do it yet, due to the fact that GPAI can really enhance attackers' capabilities, we kind of need to have something to ground these uplifts into, to know, okay, where do we need to attack, both as a defender and as a regulator and as a researcher side, the problems that we have here. And the way forward for us is something that we are currently trying to push a little bit. So we had a speaker before already also trying to put some interesting research questions out into the crowd, and this is also something that we're not really shamelessly doing here. It's really interesting to have some way to, either on the attack framework, which is what we're currently doing, but also there are a lot of different other structured methods and ways this can be done. But it should be something that really can be reused and can be applied very structuredly. Figure out what the different capability uplifts and accessibility uplifts are if AI progresses. Then, for example, also dependence on AI. So how useful is it actually to have AI in there? If you have a lot of accessibility uplift, because it just now is half as difficult for a human to do whatever task, but the task would have taken a human 30 minutes, and now it takes 15 minutes, it's not as critical, right? Then also, it would be very good to have all of this, again, coming back to the scientific method, be based on some evidences, having some confidence levels on the numbers that can be put in this metadata here for the attack framework. So I obviously am pushing for this because it's kind of valuable for us, because we kind of need it for the things that we're doing, but also it has a lot of different other benefits that could be had. So for example, for defenders, it's quite relevant. If I know which CTPs or whichever terminology you want to be using, whichever frameworks you want to be using, are going to be significantly uplifted by AI, I know where to put my focus next. Because I think it's no surprise for especially anybody here, AI is going to not get worse anymore, and it'll likely get much better. So as a defender, I need to move now, and I need to move fast. But I can't move fast into my entire defensive infrastructure. It doesn't work like that. I don't have 1 million people in every company to just do security. It won't work like that. So if I'm the defender and I have something like this, and I see, okay, these techniques are where AI is going to provide a lot of uplift, then I know where to put my focus on. I can be like, okay, remote access tooling is going to get a lot easier because you can't detect it as easily anymore, because attackers are not going to use the off-the-shelf things anymore because they're letting it just be built by AI. Not saying that this is one of the critical cases, but this is just one of the running examples we could use here from the presentation. And if that's the case, then as a defender, I need to think, okay, which other methods do I have to actually properly detect something like this? Now for AI evaluators or even researchers, it's quite important because it can actually provide a standard evidence-based reference for risk modeling. Currently, everybody's putting benchmarks out there, and none of the benchmarks are really comparable. Yes, of course, you can compare it by running the same model on different ones and then comparing the scores you get here, but there has been a nice quote flying around recently that cybersecurity is a very jagged frontier, which means a model that's good in one part of cybersecurity is not necessarily good in another part of cybersecurity. And therefore, if a model is good at this one benchmark and not good at this other benchmark, it doesn't mean that this other benchmark is much more difficult than the first one. It might just be that the model is just more and better trained on the first one. And to actually have a better common baseline between different benchmarks, having something like this which can actually put some numbers to the risk that is measured through the benchmarks is something that I think could be very, very valuable. And obviously, this is partially a thing for AI evaluators and AI regulators, but also generally for AI providers. This is one of the chances researchers can have if they put up a good framework, if they put up a good model, to say, look, dear AI providers, if your models get better, these are the things it really should not be getting better at, because if they get better there, then the entire risk scenarios are, the bottlenecks in the risk scenarios might be saturated, and then we have a real big problem. So this is also something where a lot of interplay can happen, even without direct interactions between the researchers and model providers, because even the model providers, this is also something that's based on the code of practice, need to do the risk modeling and their evaluations based on state of the art. So whenever a new researcher publishes something new and furthers this state of the art, this is something that immediately needs to be picked up by the model providers, because they're legally obligated to, as soon as they have a GPAISR model, that they stay on the state of the art. So if you want to push very strongly and get the model providers to be better in their security, this is a very easy, in quotation marks, way to get them to do more and to be better. I'm a bit under time actually, but I guess I'm going to open it up for questions if anybody has some.